Good afternoon, my name is Josh from CyclonesOZ, and here is your afternoon bulletin on Tropical Cyclone Alfred. Still a Category 2 strength tropical cyclone, but barrelling now to the southeast Queensland coastline, where a landfall is inevitable and expected to happen in about 36 hours' time. Tropical Cyclone Alfred is an extremely dangerous cyclone. There's a lot of information to be getting through here, and the forecast has changed substantially with some major details to be talking about, so stick around to the end of the video. If you are brand new to the channel, please consider subscribing and also click the join button down below to get access to some exclusive perks. But let's talk about Tropical Cyclone Alfred now, and what it's doing just offshore from the southeast of Queensland. Well, it does look rather impressive, that's for sure. It's really starting to rebuild some of that convection that it lost overnight when it was doing that loop-the-loop, and it also looks to be now on a set course over towards Queensland, moving due west now at about 12 kilometres an hour. This tropical cyclone is still a Category 2 status. You can see it's funneling ashore some pretty intense rain bands as well, which have cyclonic winds in them, and I can imagine people on the Gold Coast will attest to this, that it is getting really bumpy really quickly when these shower bands come through, with very strong wind gusts sustained for an extended period of time and some heavy periods of rainfall as well across the northeast of New South Wales and into the southeast of Queensland. You can see wind observations at Cape Byron at the lighthouse there, 70 kilometres an hour out of the southeast and only increasing as well, and then wind observations up through the Gold Coast up to the Gold Coast Seaway, about 40 to 50 kilometres an hour with stronger gusts up to about 80 kilometres an hour with these passing shower bands. Winds at the Cape Norton lighthouse at 65 kilometres an hour now and strengthening, with gale force winds now in the Bureau of Meteorology's cone over Stradbroke Island, and those winds are only going to increase and conditions will only deteriorate throughout the remainder of today. But yeah, regardless of how this system is funneling ashore these cyclonic conditions, it is looking impressive on satellite imagery, and it's really starting to rebuild itself. And the convection that it lost last night, I mean, you can see it here with all these clouds just ripping into the southern side of this tropical cyclone. It's certainly starting to rebuild itself up nicely now, and it looks like Queensland is definitely now in for the thwarting that we've been expecting over the last couple of days. This is certainly going to be a historic tropical cyclone, and this convection, with it only continuing to build, as I've said for the nth time already, this forecast update, it really does look like Alfred has places to be in destruction to cause, which is a very, very scary prospect indeed for southeast Queensland. Let's talk about the tropical cyclone's forecast now. There have been some substantial changes overnight. We're going to go into great detail with them. So the Axis forecast model, which is what the Bureau of Meteorology bases their forecast off, is again this morning looking like the most accurate forecast model out of this tropical cyclone. This update is a few hours old now, but you can see the Axis G3 forecast taking the system into North Stradbroke Island at about Friday afternoon into Friday evening, in line with what the Bureau of Meteorology is suggesting for a landfall here. However, again, there's an interesting feature with these forecasts saying that the tropical cyclone will either slow down or do a bit of a loop-the-loop as it approaches a landfall here. It's going to slow down and start moving quite erratically before landfall, which is causing some major headaches for forecasters right now, because once it starts doing loop-the-loop or it starts swinging around and deviating off its expected track, the landfall impacts are going to be drastically different across some of these locations, because this is a case of a tropical cyclone where in the cone of uncertainty there's some huge uncertainty with where the tropical cyclone's worst impacts are going to be. So when we've got an uncertain landfall forecast once again, which is kind of what we have right now, it really does make it quite difficult as a forecaster to say exactly what sort of impacts can be expected when and where. A loop-the-loop landfall like this is absolutely unprecedented, but then again, anything with Tropical Cyclone Alfred has been pretty unprecedented. So cross-referencing that with the Bureau of Meteorology's forecast track map for Tropical Cyclone Alfred here, you can see calling for that landfall to happen sometime in the afternoon, just north or on North Stradbroke Island before tomorrow evening. We're expecting that landfall to move through into the Brisbane metro area. In fact, landing pretty much on top of the Brisbane airport. That's a deviation of about 30 kilometres north to what it was yesterday. You can see the Axis forecast model calling for that sharp deviation up to the north, and major forecast models are also calling for that substantial deviation towards the north, either before landfall or during landfall, or doing a bit of the loop-the-loop. So that's a very interesting feature on the forecast, being pushed north by a trough tomorrow afternoon, and again, that's going to have dramatic ramifications on where the worst impacts are going to be, and it'll also prolong the tropical cyclone's landfall process. And I'll get to the impacts and what we can expect in a later part of the video, but just the forecast track right now, it's really confusing, and I imagine a lot of people are really scratching their heads. The longer this system sits offshore as well, the stronger it is going to get and the more organised it is going to get. So the ideal situation is if it comes into shore and makes its landfall early tomorrow morning, which is looking exceedingly unlikely now, and the further north it gets as well, it's going to make a marginal difference in terms of intensity, but it still will be slightly stronger, and it'll also happen to bring the worst impacts ashore into the Gold Coast. So there's a lot of moving parts at play here in the forecast, and it is quite difficult to understand. In terms of how strong this tropical cyclone will be on landfall, which right now I'm saying with a high degree of confidence will be on North Stradbroke Island, which is for the most part uninhabited, a few population centres here and there, Point Lookout being the most notable, which is likely to be absolutely thrashed in this tropical cyclone. But with that landfall being on North Stradbroke Island, it'll bring the worst conditions ashore anywhere south of the immediate landfall sites. That includes South Stradbroke Island, the Gold Coast Seaway area, including the Gold Coast, and then down towards Burleigh Heads, Tweed Heads, and as far south as Byron Bay is where the strongest winds are going to be. And you can see here peak wind gusts on the Axis G3 forecast model upon the landfall, expecting wind gusts here being funneled into the northeastern corner of New South Wales, well in that destructive wind swathe there, up to 125 kilometres an hour, and likely much stronger than that as well, with 3-second gusts possible to be as high as 155 kilometres an hour. Sustained winds around the northern side of the system will be slightly weaker. You can still see, though, damaging winds expected across Moreton Bay and into the Moreton Island area, and across North Stradbroke Island as well, with winds averaging about 90 to 110 kilometres an hour, with stronger gusts up to 140 kilometres an hour. And then, like I said, anywhere south immediately of that landfall site, including South Stradbroke Island, then especially between the Gold Coast down to Byron Bay, wind gusts along the coast there through Friday night will be up to 155 kilometres an hour, with the strongest wind gusts in exposed, elevated and coastal locations, especially around Burleigh Heads and at Tweed Heads. You can see there are discrepancies between the forecast models. The Icon model is the most notable here, calling for this absolute brute of a system to sit offshore from Queensland and then move in for landfall sometime Saturday afternoon, which does raise the point that there is still uncertainty with this system. But the Icon model can be a notoriously inaccurate forecast model, and certainly not one that I'm recommending people use for a forecast here. I'm just using it as an illustration that there is quite a lot of uncertainty here. And the GFS forecast model also calling for the loop-the-loop pattern. In fact, the GFS over the last couple of days has actually been calling for this system to dive north up the Sunshine Coast. It also exceedingly unlikely right now. I know some news agencies have been reporting on it, as I've been told in the comment section down below, which is just fear-mongering at this point here, moving it up north of Brisbane, then into the Sunshine Coast. I don't think that's going to happen either. Just my personal take on this tropical cyclone is it's going to continue in that westerly motion, head over North Stradbroke Island, somewhere between Russell Island and up towards Point Lookout. It could make a landfall on the extreme southern tip of Moreton Island, and that is becoming a more likely situation as this tropical cyclone deviates a little bit further towards the north. And then a couple of hours later, after its initial landfall at about 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, that landfall at about 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening on the Brisbane coastline here, either in Redland City or up towards the port, or even as north as the airport. We could be seeing a landfall through there. The impacts around the Brisbane area, considering the tropical cyclone will lose a little bit of intensity as it moves over North Stradbroke Island, then into the Brisbane area, whilst we will still see a dangerous cyclone pass over the Brisbane metro area. And again, it's not really reciprocated between the forecast models. They're really struggling to tell how strong the system's going to be once it gets itself over land. Sustained winds in the Brisbane metro area should be between 60 and 70 kilometres an hour, with peak gusts up to 125 kilometres an hour. It will still feel like the storm of the century around Brisbane, but it will pale in comparison to what the Gold Coast is expecting to experience from Tropical Cyclone Alfred. And I cannot stress this enough, and I'll talk about it in great detail at the back half of this video, but the Gold Coast is expecting to be thrashed with winds up to 155 kilometres an hour. Absolutely unprecedented wind speeds for this part of Queensland into the northeast of New South Wales. Even the strongest east coast lows pale in comparison to how strong the winds will be in Tropical Cyclone Alfred as it makes its crossing of the Queensland coastline. The southern side of the storm, unfortunately, we really don't have any reasonable or good radar observations there right now, but you can see some intense convection really building up there and plenty of rainfall. So this tropical cyclone is definitely on the way up in terms of intensity, and it is a concerning forecast for the southeast of Queensland, that's for sure. Very, very interesting indeed, and certainly something we'll be watching very closely over the next couple of days. Now, potential impacts of this tropical cyclone. I'll get to wind and rainfall in a second, but the most dangerous impact right now is going to be that storm surge, especially for the Gold Coast and into the northeastern parts of New South Wales. You can see significant wave heights already building along the coastline. They're about 6 metres right now across parts of New South Wales, and about 5 metres across parts of Queensland as well. I'm going to see if I can find some wave observations, but I don't think any of those are available on windy.com, but the webcams across the southeastern corner of Queensland into the northeastern parts of New South Wales do them. Will showcase them really well. I mean, have a look at this here into the Gold Coast. This is at Northcliffe Surf Club. You can see the look at the waves right now. They're just absolutely monstrous. So already really starting to build, and they're only going to get bigger from here. They're about 5 metres off the Gold Coast right now, and look at what's lining up tonight offshore from the coastline, up to 8, even up towards 9 metres. So the waves are half the height of what they're going to be later on tonight. It is going to be wild, that's for sure. Coupled with that, along the high tide tomorrow morning, we're expecting a significant storm tide as well, about 1 metre above the highest astronomical tide for the Gold Coast, and then as a tropical cyclone makes its landfall for the second high tide of the day into the evening hours of Friday, expecting another storm surge of about 1.5 to 2.5 meters above the highest astronomical tide, which in itself isn't dangerous and it isn't devastating. It will still cause some inundation of low-lying locations, but considering the majority of homes and houses along the Sanctuary Cove, the Coomera area, and then down towards the Gold Coast and into the main beach, Surfers Paradise, Broad Beach, those sort of areas, those houses are about 5 meters above sea level. But what's really concerning me is considering this, you've got South Stradbroke Island here. There's one exit for water through the Logan River and the Coomera River up here between South and North Stradbroke Islands, and then you've got another channel here at the Gold Coast Seaway, which dissects the areas between the Coomera River and then the Nerang River. Now, keep in mind that the rainfall's already really starting to pipe up now across parts of southeast Queensland, northeast New South Wales, torrential fall, so those rivers are already starting to fill up. The Hinds Dam is losing water now because that's well and truly at capacity and still rising, and once you get those storm surges and those wave heights that block the release of water from these areas through here, because it's going to act like a dam, the amount of water trying to flow into these areas, coupling with the high tide, and then the amount of water trying to flow out, I mean, it just doesn't work. You can't have water flowing into water, and it's just going to dam things up here and just create a massive problem in here with floodwaters across the Gold Coast and into the canals area. So I'm actually expecting significant storm tides of about 4 or even 5 meters above the highest astronomical tide, which means if you haven't sandbagged your property right now, especially if you live along the canals or within about 100 meters of a water body and you're not elevated, you need to be doing that this morning, and that's a non-negotiable. If you're not doing that, regardless of how strong the winds are right now, provided it is safe to do so, which for the most part it is still reasonably safe to do so with the right precautions, you need to be sandbagging because your home will be inundated with storm surges and waves like this. Considering Alfred has had about a week over in the Coral Sea to really build up its waves and its significant storm surge, and it's done a really good job of doing that. I mean, we've had significant wave heights off the Cape Morton area and off Fraser Island up to about 17 meters in height, so this tropical cyclone has some absolutely monstrous waves in it, and they'll be coming ashore very shortly. And considering the fact that the storm tides are already extreme and the coastal erosion around the Gold Coast from yesterday has been extreme, and we're still about a day and a half away from the tropical cyclone's impact, you need to be fully prepared for this in the next couple of hours. And the good thing about this cyclone being delayed is you do actually have this morning to prepare, and I'll talk about that in a later part of the video, but you do still have this morning to finalize your preparations and rush them to completion. Tropical Cyclone Alfred will be effectively storm of the century for southeast Queensland and northeastern New South Wales. Very significant stuff indeed. Now, wind threat. We've talked about this already in detail in this forecast update, but I just want to go over it once more. You can see peak wind gusts expected around the southeastern corner of Queensland between the major forecast models. I believe the icon actually does a pretty good job for the land areas, not so much out to sea, but the land areas have been done a pretty good job by the icon forecast model. Starting in the north and heading south, you can see up to about Noosa, we're expecting the chance of cyclonic winds up there with gusts as high as 90 or even 100 kilometres an hour. Winds should be below 100 kilometres an hour until you get south of Caloundra, so Maroochydore, Mooloolaba, Caloundra expecting wind gusts peaking out at about 100 kilometres an hour, and then down towards Bribie Island, wind gusts will peak out at 125 kilometres an hour, especially late Friday night into Saturday morning as the cyclone moves inland. The winds swing around back to the north and from the northeast for Bribie Island, and then heading into the airport as well, same story there, wind gusts up to 130 kilometres an hour in the backside of this tropical cyclone after it makes landfall. Koppelchura wind accumulations there should be about 125 to 130 kilometres an hour depending on how exposed or low-lying your location is. More elevated locations will get weaker wind gusts, especially once you get further out nestled into the mountains and further inland. Wind accumulations out there will be slightly weaker. Now, across the Brisbane area, the northern suburbs will be receiving their worst winds Friday night into early Saturday morning on the backside of this tropical cyclone, with significant gusts up to 130 kilometres an hour as you get out towards Redcliffe, the airport, and into the Brisbane port area. Maximum wind gusts into the Brisbane port and the Brisbane airport will be up to 140 kilometres an hour from Tropical Cyclone Alfred as it makes landfall, provided it doesn't weaken any further from where it is right now. Along Moreton Island and Stradbroke Island, wind gusts should be up to 140 kilometres an hour. South Stradbroke Island slightly higher, up to 150 kilometres an hour. Into Redland City, when this tropical cyclone makes landfall, and in the hours after, we'll be seeing wind accumulations there up to 145 kilometres an hour. Peak wind gusts will be associated along the coastline. Once you get further inland, wind gusts there will drop to about 120 kilometres an hour. So 120 kilometres an hour, nothing absolutely unprecedented, that's for sure. I mean, we do get that severe thunderstorms every now and then, so homes will survive that. There will be significant damage though, but 145 kilometres an hour will cause some major damage. So again, if you live in an exposed and coastal location, there's nothing between you And these winds are no homes, no fences, no lines of trees, which again would be equally dangerous. Expect some really significant property damage, roof failures and whatnot. So again, make sure you are ready for that. And if you're not, it is definitely pushing too late to prepare. Ipswich peak winds up to about 100 kilometers an hour. The cyclone will weaken very quickly as you get further inland. Logan City winds up to about 125 kilometers an hour. Again, out there, nothing absolutely unprecedented. Severe thunderstorms can deliver those types of winds out there, but still some substantial wind damage is expected and roof failures and whatnot. So make sure you are in an interior part of your house. Like I said, South Stradbroke Island, ground zero down towards the Gold Coast as well, ground zero and exposed coastal locations along the beach. So if you're the first line of properties along the beach there, including the towers around the Gold Coast area, expect wind gusts up to 150 kilometers an hour with maximum wind gusts down in the southern part of the Gold Coast down towards Burleigh Heads and Tweed Heads up to 155 kilometers an hour. The strongest wind gusts should top out at about 155 kilometers an hour. Inland into the more suburban areas away from the canals, winds should max out at about 130 kilometers an hour through the Gold Coast area, and as you get out towards Nerang, winds will weaken substantially up to about 110 kilometers an hour. Into Springbrook National Park, depending on how exposed your places are around the Hines Dam area, wind gusts will top out at about 120 kilometers an hour out there. Like I said, down into the New South Wales part of things, equally powerful wind gusts expected around Tweed Heads. Wind gusts will top out at about 130 to 155 kilometers an hour there. Sustained winds of well in excess of 110 kilometers an hour rather expected for a sustained period of time of up to 6 hours. Along the coastline down to Byron Bay, winds between 130 and 150 kilometers an hour expected. The Byron Bay Lighthouse should pick up wind gusts topping out at 150 kilometers an hour as well, with weaker wind gusts as you get further inland into the hinterland areas in the northeastern corner of New South Wales. As you get south of Byron Bay, those winds will drop off. Ballina, wind gusts expected to be around that 130 kilometer an hour mark, and then south of that, non-destructive wind gusts expected south of Yamba, with gusts around the Yamba area topping out at about 120 kilometers an hour, and then as you get further south than that, the wind gusts will drop off substantially. Again, this is the actual expectation. The forecast models obviously can't do everything the justice that it deserves, and that's why there are discrepancies between my numbers that I'm saying here, which will pan out to be true for the most part in a lot of these locations, and what's actually expected on the forecast models. Into the Gold Coast hinterland, like I mentioned, if you live in a very exposed location, expect some significant wind gusts, especially around the Mount Tamborine area. In exposed locations, you could be seeing wind gusts up to 130 kilometers an hour, even though you are still far inland. Murray-Willumbah as well, wind gusts up to 130 kilometers an hour possible, and then as you get further inland, those winds will drop off substantially. And I highlight my point there as this tropical cyclone heads further inland, the winds will weaken off substantially, and you can see out towards Toowoomba, wind gusts won't be stronger than 90 kilometers an hour as this tropical cyclone heads further inland. Whew, that is a lot of talk on wind speeds. Let's talk about rainfall right now, an equally important part of the forecast. This is a map of rainfall accumulation, so total falling rainfall over the selected period of time, which I've chosen to be 72 hours. So over the next 72 hours, this is how much rainfall is expected. And I'm going to use the East Anglia forecast model for this. I feel like it paints the most accurate picture from this tropical cyclone, but again, there are discrepancies that I would like to talk about. So as this tropical cyclone lines up the coastline, we're expecting over the next 24 hours accumulations up to 150 millimeters with heavier rainfall and heavier rainfall falling throughout the remainder of today and into early tomorrow morning around the Gold Coast and into the northeastern parts of New South Wales. Peak rainfall accumulation starting in the north and heading south as usual, up to about 100 millimeters along the southern extremities of the Sunshine Coast. Bribie Island could see up to 125 millimeters, and then down towards Brisbane is where the real rainfall will start. 125 to 175 millimeters expected around Redcliffe, and up to 200 millimeters expected in the Brisbane metro area out towards the airport and also down towards the harbour too. Redland City, depending on if the landfall goes straight over them or a little bit further north, they could be seeing accumulations up to 250 millimeters. Logan City, rainfall accumulations up to 300 millimeters possible. Major flooding is expected in these areas, that goes without saying, through the Logan River, which will include flash flooding and major riverine flooding. Significant rainfall accumulations along the Stradbroke Islands as well. Rainfall accumulations there could be up to 250 millimeters of sideways rainfall. That will be very intense stuff and unlike anything you've seen in those locations before. Rainfall accumulations will start to get real as you get south of Coomera and the Gold Coast, with Sanctuary Cove rather, down towards the Gold Coast, with peak rainfall accumulations throughout this entire tropical cyclone's landfall process of up to 400 millimeters, with higher accumulations possible with the rainfall accumulations that are expected today and in the backside of this tropical cyclone. Peak falls over the next 3 days could max out at about 700 millimeters along the Gold Coast hinterland area, with isolated spot falls depending on how slow moving this tropical cyclone is and how much moisture it sucks in on the backside, which, spoiler alert, is looking like quite a lot, up to 1,000 millimeters possible over the next 5 days. Accumulations into the northeastern corner of New South Wales around around the Tweed Heads area will be around that 500mm mark. Again, very much dependent on how much rainfall gets sucked in on the backside of the system. And then as you head further south down towards Byron Bay, rainfall accumulations up to about 400mm expected there. Rainfall accumulations along the coastline will drop off the further south you get, with accumulations between 150 and 300mm expected south of Byron Bay, right down towards Coffs Harbour, Nambucca Heads, and then down towards Port Macquarie and Forster, those sort of areas as well. Rainfall accumulations will be substantially lighter. Significant rainfall accumulations expected inland. You can see falls up to about 500mm into the New South Wales northeastern rivers, hinterland areas. Falls between 300 and 500mm expected through those areas. Along the Queensland New South Wales border, like we've said, that will be the wettest location, with spot falls up to 1,000mm possible. Now on the backside of this tropical cyclone, this is where the real uncertainties really begin to pipe up. If this tropical cyclone heads inland as expected right now really quickly, the rainfall accumulations on the backside of this tropical cyclone won't be as heavy as what they will be. Keep in mind the majority of this rainfall will actually come in on the backside of this tropical cyclone, so after it's made landfall, with the majority of rainfall coming through after Friday midday, and especially heavy falls expected right through Saturday and in towards Sunday morning as well. If this tropical cyclone decides to stall over the southeast of Queensland, heavy falls will continue in towards Sunday, with the rainfall expected to ease off through Sunday night into Monday morning. There will still be showers and thunderstorms continuing through Monday and in towards Tuesday, and it won't be until mid next week until the rainfall begins to finally clear out of the southeast corner of Queensland. But I'll repeat that again, rainfall won't get properly heavy and properly tropical cyclonic until at least Friday lunchtime, when this tropical cyclone will be moving in for a landfall, and then the backside of this tropical cyclone after it makes landfall is where the real deal of this rainfall will be. And once it gets itself over those warmer sea temperatures, it'll be blowing up convection left, right and centre, so regardless of it being a strong or organised tropical cyclone, a lot of moisture and a lot of thunderstorms will be dragged into the southeast of Queensland and the northeast of New South Wales, leading to some extreme rainfall accumulations. I don't want to say never before seen in this part of Queensland into the northeast of New South Wales. The type of rainfall is definitely never before seen, that's for sure, in the nature of a tropical cyclone, but I still expect rainfall accumulations to be rivaling that of Tropical Cyclone Debbie back in 2017. As such, some really significant flooding can be expected. The following rivers need to prepare for moderate flooding. That includes the Logan and the Brisbane rivers. Significant flooding is expected through there, especially through Ipswich. Some moderate to possibly major flooding in the rivers around the Ipswich area and into the Brisbane River is expected. Brisbane should peak out at the minor flooding alert depending on how high that storm surge gets, though we could be seeing moderate flooding around the Brisbane city area. Significant flooding also expected into the Logan River, which does do a pretty good job at draining itself, but I'm still expecting some moderate to possibly even major flooding through Logan City, and then draining out in towards the Moreton Bay area. We could still be seeing some possible flooding in those areas as well. The Coomera River, considering it's going to be jammed up by storm surge, will not have an opportunity to drain, so major flooding expected especially upstream from the Coomera River, and then draining out of the Hinds Dam area, the Nerang River. Some really significant major flooding can be expected there as well, right down into the suburban Gold Coast area, where moderate to major flooding can be expected through the suburban Gold Coast areas as well. So again, if you live in a flood prone area, if you've flooded before around the Nerang River, make sure you are prepared for some major flooding once again. Sandbagging up the first story of your home, moving valuables and important possessions such as your family up into the second story of your home, and evacuating if possible and if you have the means to do so, which I strongly advise against right now. It's definitely starting to head into the it's too late to evacuate territory. Significant flooding also expected further south along the border. You can see down towards the Currumbin Creek, some significant rainfall also expected to fill those areas as well, and some major flash flooding expected into the Currumbin Valley area. Through Tweed Heads, again, the Tweed River expecting some significant rainfall in those areas as well. The Terranora Creek as well, expecting some significant rainfall accumulations through there, and then flowing out of the Nerang catchment area and into the Springbrook National Park, the Ross River as well, flowing into the Tweed River. Some significant, possibly major flooding can also be expected in those areas as well. Major flooding expected in the Rouse River and also the Tweed River as well, as we push the forecast forward in towards Saturday morning and Saturday night, with major flooding only easing off in the Tweed catchment area as we get out towards Monday. So some really significant flooding expected there. I think it's obvious as well that New South Wales is going to cop the brunt of this flooding. It will cross the border into the Nerang area and into the Hinds Dam area, which will likely peak at about 140% capacity, but the worst of the flooding will be reserved for the northeastern corner of New South Wales. Significant flooding also expected as you get down towards the Brunswick River as well, around Brunswick Heads. Moderate flooding expected there, and then the Wilsons River flowing through Lismore, expecting moderate to possibly major flooding. Lismore is certainly at a high risk of major flooding at this time. Major flooding will continue down through Lismore and the Wilsons River, and then heading into the Richmond River as well. Major flooding expected through Broadwater, Waldale, and then out towards Berlin Carolina as well. Major flooding also possible into the river flowing through Grafton, the Clarence River, that's the one there. Significant flooding can be expected in those areas. Moderate flooding is very likely around Grafton, but major flooding is also still a possibility, and we want people to be prepared for major flooding down there. Flooding will continue right through the creeks and tributary rivers flowing down the New South Wales coastline as far south as the Barrington Tops, with minor flooding expected as far south as the Barrington Tops, and I believe there is a flood watch that captures the entire northeastern rivers corner of New South Wales as well. It's going to be a really significant flooding event. And then rivers that flow into the Murray-Darling Basin as well will get a very significant helping of rainfall as well, considering they drain the backside of the Great Dividing Range, and I'm expecting some significant flooding as well in the weeks following this rainfall event and Tropical Cyclone Alfred's passing through parts of the Murray-Darling Basin, expecting some major flooding to then flow out into the Murray and the Darling rivers later on into the forecast period. We'll be pushing this rainfall out for a couple of months. That's how long it'll take it to get down towards the release areas of the Murray-Darling River down in South Australia. So this flooding will be an extended period of time through New South Wales and Victoria as well. I'm expecting flood warnings to not go away for, like I said, an extended period of time. It has been a long forecast update. So just briefly, what we need to be doing across southeast Queensland and New South Wales. It is too late now to evacuate unless you are ready to go and you can get in the car in the next 5 minutes. If you are planning on doing so, make sure you are getting yourself inland or up towards the Sunshine Coast. Brisbane, again, is still going to be in the firing line of Tropical Cyclone Alfred. I also strongly advise against evacuating right now. I think that is an extremely dangerous decision to be making, and I believe people should be heeding the warnings and now starting to bunker down. That curfew is there for a reason. Around the Gold Coast, expecting some really significant flooding there. So if you haven't done your sandbagging around your property and you're planning on staying, make sure you are fully sandbagged by midnight tonight. The rainfall will then begin to pipe up as we get into the early hours of tomorrow morning. It is very lucky that Cyclone Alfred has been a slow-moving system and it's still located out to sea, and the rainfall hasn't properly started up yet because it's given people a couple more hours that we didn't really expect to have to prepare for this tropical cyclone, and it's likely that they'll continue to have a couple more hours before the conditions get really nasty. But keep watching the radar. It's shower bands like these that are giving me a lot of concerns and sending me the shivers because they're the ones carrying the cyclonic winds and the really heavy rainfall, and you can already start to see the wind observations here are expected to pick up momentarily in these parts around the Tweed Heads areas. These shower bands across the coastline, they're fast moving, they're violent, and they are wild. So play it safe, play it cool, and stay cool, calm, and collected. For Brisbane, the Gold Coast, and into the northeastern parts of New South Wales, as far south as Byron Bay, a historic tropical cyclone is on the way, and it is going to bring some really significant and some really gnarly storm conditions to you, and it's going to be unlike any weather event ever seen before across this part of Queensland and New South Wales. At least that is what the forecast is suggesting right now. I hope you found this forecast update informative. It's been a very long one. I think it's probably been my longest video on record as well. So much detail to talk about here. If you have found it informative, then please do leave a like and also subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I hope this has been a help. I hope that everybody is prepared, and I'm sending my best to Queensland and New South Wales in an event like this. This is a very dangerous situation, and I don't want to understate that. I also don't want to be fear casting as well, so any feedback, please do leave that in the comment section down below. But I'm sending my best wishes to the parts of Queensland and New South Wales that are going to be affected by Tropical Cyclone Alfred. But that is all for me today. A special shout out to the channel sponsors. Without them, I could not run the show. Then the support is much appreciated over there, and I'll catch you all in the next storm. Goodbye.